Imagine a future where humanity controls the very systems that govern Earth's climate. Consider the possibility of cooling the planet not through decades of reduced emissions, but with technology deployed in the span of months. Now picture the other side of that vision. Unintended storms, disrupted ecosystems, and a planet that rebels against our interventions. The idea of geoengineering, often described as climate manipulation, has moved from the fringes of scientific speculation into the realm of serious debate. As the climate crisis deepens and global temperatures rise, political leaders, corporations, and some scientific communities are forced to ask a controversial question. Should humanity attempt to deliberately engineer Earth's climate? The appeal is clear. Faced with increasingly devastating heat waves, flooding, wildfires, and the steady march of sea level rise, people want solutions that promise speed and scale. Traditional climate responses like cutting emissions, investing in renewable energy, and promoting conservation remain essential, but they are slow to produce results and require global cooperation, something in short supply. Geoengineering offers the seductive promise of control, of bending nature to our will in order to buy time. But with that promise comes peril. The question is not just whether we can engineer Earth, but whether we can survive the risks that follow. At the core of the geoengineering debate are two broad categories of intervention: solar radiation management, SRM, and carbon dioxide removal, CDR. SRM involves reflecting sunlight away from Earth to cool the planet. Proposals range from injecting reflective particles into the stratosphere to brightening clouds over the ocean. CDR, by contrast, seeks to remove greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. Ideas include massive programs of afforestation, direct air capture technologies that vacuum CO2 from the sky, and even seeding the ocean with iron to stimulate plankton blooms that absorb carbon. Both categories share one feature. They are unprecedented experiments with the most complex system we know, the Earth's climate. The scale is planetary, and the margin for error is terrifyingly small. Proponents argue that the risks of inaction are greater than the risks of intervention. They point to the accelerating pace of climate change and the failure of international agreements to keep emissions under control. For communities already experiencing deadly floods, prolonged droughts, or the slow death of coral reefs, geoengineering represents not hubris but survival. Supporters also argue that we already engage in accidental geoengineering every time we emit greenhouse gases or pollute the air with aerosols. The difference, they say, is that planned interventions would be designed to mitigate damage rather than cause it. Critics, however, warn of unintended consequences that could cascade beyond human control. Consider solar radiation management through stratospheric aerosol injection. By dispersing reflective particles high in the atmosphere, SRM could theoretically lower global temperatures within a year. The concept draws evidence from natural events such as volcanic eruptions. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, it spewed millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, leading to a measurable cooling of global temperatures for nearly 2 years. Mimicking this effect could provide rapid relief. But unlike a one-time eruption, deliberate and sustained injection would need to continue for decades or even centuries. The moment the program stopped, a phenomenon known as termination shock could trigger rapid warming, far more destructive than the gradual increases we face today. Moreover, cooling the Earth evenly is virtually impossible. Some regions might benefit, while others might experience devastating droughts or shifts in monsoon patterns. Whose interests would determine the acceptable balance? Carbon dioxide removal sounds safer, but it too carries risks. Direct air capture plants are expensive and energy intensive. Scaling them to remove billions of tons of CO2 annually is far beyond current capacity. Afforestation projects, while valuable, compete with agricultural land and risk creating monocultures that damage biodiversity. Ocean fertilization has the potential to alter marine ecosystems in unpredictable ways, from disrupting food chains to worsening oxygen depletion zones. In all cases, the danger lies not only in what we know, but in what we cannot predict. Earth's climate system is interconnected, and even small perturbations can lead to feedback loops with far-reaching consequences. Beyond the technical challenges, lie geopolitical and ethical minefields. Imagine a single nation or a coalition deciding to launch a geoengineering program without global consensus. The weather patterns of neighboring countries could be altered, creating the perception, if not the reality, of weaponization. Countries suffering from drought might blame interventions in another hemisphere. Legal frameworks for governing such actions are weak or non-existent, raising the prospect of climate wars, fought not only with emissions, but with deliberate manipulations of sunlight and rainfall. Even if agreements could be reached, who would enforce them? And who would bear the responsibility for failures? There is also the problem of moral hazard. If geoengineering appears viable, will governments and corporations slow their efforts to reduce emissions? Will the promise of a technological fix undermine the political will to pursue hard but necessary choices like phasing out fossil fuels? History suggests this is a real danger. Humans often prefer short-term convenience over long-term discipline. If geoengineering becomes a crutch, society might find itself dependent on increasingly drastic interventions, deepening the cycle of manipulation and unintended consequences. Yet dismissing geoengineering outright may not be realistic. The urgency of the climate crisis forces us to confront options that once seemed unthinkable. For communities facing existential threats, geoengineering is not an abstract debate, but a potential lifeline. This creates a paradox. To ignore geoengineering risks being unprepared for desperate scenarios, but to embrace it too quickly risks unleashing consequences we cannot control. The prudent path may lie in cautious research, conducting small-scale, transparent trials to better understand what is possible while maintaining focus on mitigation and adaptation as the primary tools of climate action. The role of public perception cannot be underestimated. For many, the idea of engineering Earth evokes both awe and fear. Popular culture often portrays climate manipulation as dystopian, from movies that depict frozen wastelands after failed experiments to novels warning of techno-dictatorships controlling the weather. These narratives shape public opinion, influencing whether democratic societies will support or reject real-world experiments. Scientists, therefore, must not only conduct careful research but also communicate openly, ensuring that geoengineering does not become a secretive project hidden from public scrutiny. Transparency and inclusion are essential to legitimacy. At the heart of this debate is a deeper question. What kind of relationship do we want with our planet? Geoengineering reflects humanity's drive to control, to bend natural systems to human will. But history teaches us that interventions in nature often bring unintended consequences. The Green Revolution boosted agricultural yields but also intensified chemical pollution. Large dams provide electricity but displace communities and disrupt ecosystems. Genetic modification offers breakthroughs but sparks ethical controversies. Each attempt to engineer natural systems carries trade-offs. Geoengineering is simply the largest and most consequential version of this pattern. Can we truly claim to manage Earth's climate without becoming prisoners of our own designs? The coming decades will test humanity's ability to make collective decisions about its future. As climate impacts intensify, pressure will mount for rapid solutions. Politicians may find it tempting to fund geoengineering projects as a demonstration of bold leadership. Tech entrepreneurs may see opportunities for profit in building massive air capture facilities or developing cloud-brightening fleets. Civil society may fracture between those who see intervention as survival and those who see it as arrogance. Meanwhile, the climate clock keeps ticking, leaving less time for careful deliberation. Ultimately, the story of geoengineering is a story about risk and responsibility. The risks are profound, spanning environmental, political, and ethical dimensions. The responsibility is global, requiring unprecedented cooperation among nations that already struggle to find common ground. No single country, no matter how powerful, can control Earth's climate without affecting others. That interdependence makes geoengineering as much a political challenge as a scientific one. In the end, the debate is not simply about technology, but about values. Do we value caution over speed, collective governance over unilateral action, mitigation over manipulation? The answers will shape not only the trajectory of geoengineering, but the broader future of humanity's relationship with the planet. Perhaps the greatest danger is not that we fail to develop geoengineering, but that we rush to deploy it without first confronting these deeper questions. If the climate crisis demands boldness, it also demands wisdom. And wisdom requires humility. The recognition that Earth is not just a machine to be managed, but a living system upon which we all depend. The vision of engineering Earth tempts us with the illusion of control, but it also warns us of the fragility of that control. Can humanity survive the risks of climate manipulation? The answer lies not in technology alone, but in the choices we make. Choices that will define whether geoengineering becomes a tool of survival, a weapon of destruction, or a reminder that sometimes the boldest path is restraint. The conversation about climate manipulation, often framed as geoengineering, is not just about science and technology. It is a reflection of the choices, fears, and ambitions that humanity carries into the future. Part 1 raised the fundamental question of survival versus risk, but Part 2 must dig deeper into the mechanics of how such interventions would unfold, the institutions that might govern them, and the fractures they could expose in the global order. Engineering Earth is not simply a matter of deploying tools. It is an experiment in redefining the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems that sustain it. The first challenge is the illusion of precision. Climate models provide increasingly accurate predictions of temperature trends, rainfall, and storm intensity, but they remain approximations. Even the most advanced supercomputers cannot fully capture the chaotic dynamics of Earth's interconnected systems. When scientists propose scattering reflective aerosols in the stratosphere or fertilizing oceans to encourage carbon uptake, they rely on models that estimate probabilities, not guarantees. This raises a sobering prospect. Interventions could have results that diverge dramatically from expectations. A program intended to reduce average global temperature might succeed overall, but devastate specific regions with drought, disrupt agriculture, or intensify hurricanes. The unevenness of these outcomes raises not just technical but moral questions. Who decides which regions are sacrificed for the greater good? This leads directly into the problem of governance. The planet has no central authority, no single institution capable of managing a global-scale climate intervention. The United Nations may appear to be the obvious candidate, but its track record on climate agreements reveals deep limitations. Even the Paris Agreement, hailed as a milestone, relies on voluntary pledges and faces persistent struggles over accountability. If countries already find it difficult to coordinate on emissions reductions, the prospect of coordinating on deliberate climate manipulation is daunting. Without a binding framework, the risk of unilateral action grows. Imagine one country, or a coalition of wealthy nations, deciding that they can no longer wait for consensus and moving ahead with a geoengineering project. Other nations, feeling excluded or threatened, could retaliate diplomatically, economically, or even militarily. What begins as a technological project could ignite geopolitical conflict. The governance dilemma is compounded by the potential for weaponization. Climate manipulation is not a neutral technology. If a nation has the capacity to alter weather patterns, even unintentionally, others might perceive that capacity as a tool of war. A drought in South Asia, a flood in Africa, or a failed monsoon in the Middle East could be blamed on interventions conducted thousands of miles away. Whether or not such claims are scientifically valid, the perception alone could destabilize international relations. Already, accusations of weather warfare circulate during natural disasters, fueled by conspiracy theories. The arrival of actual climate engineering projects would add fuel to these suspicions, with consequences for global trust and stability. Another layer of complexity lies in economics. Geoengineering is often presented as a cheaper alternative to emissions reductions. For example, some estimates suggest that solar radiation management could cost tens of billions of dollars annually, a small fraction of global GDP. Compared to the trillions required for full-scale decarbonization, the math appears seductive. Yet this framing is deceptive. First, those estimates do not account for the cost of unintended consequences, which could dwarf the savings. Second, they overlook the reality that geoengineering does not address the root cause of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, but merely masks their effects. This means that even as the atmosphere continues to fill with CO2, oceans continue to acidify, ecosystems continue to degrade, and societies remain vulnerable. In effect, geoengineering might buy time, but it does not solve the underlying crisis. Treating it as a substitute for mitigation risks creating a dangerous dependency. The dependency trap is where the concept of termination shock becomes especially chilling. If humanity embarks on a large-scale SRM program, global temperatures might stabilize or even fall. But if, due to political upheaval, financial collapse, or technological failure, the program suddenly stopped, the suppressed warming would return with a vengeance. Instead of gradual increases, the world could face decades' worth of warming compressed into just a few years. Ecosystems, already under strain, would be unable to adapt. Human societies, too, would face catastrophic shocks, mass migration, agricultural collapse, and intensified conflict. In this sense, geoengineering may not just be risky in the short term, but could lock future generations into a dependency they did not choose. The ethical questions extend beyond governance and dependency to the very philosophy of human action. Geoengineering embodies a technocratic mindset, the belief that problems created by technology can be solved by more technology. This mindset is not inherently wrong. Many technological solutions, from vaccines to renewable energy, have improved human life dramatically. But when applied to the planetary system, the stakes are qualitatively different. Climate manipulation risks crossing a boundary between managing human challenges and reprogramming the Earth itself. Critics argue that this reflects a hubristic desire to dominate nature rather than live within its limits. The ethical dilemma is not only about the consequences of interventions, but about what they reveal of humanity's character. Are we stewards of the Earth or its engineers? This philosophical tension is amplified by cultural perspectives. Different societies hold different worldviews about humanity's relationship with nature. Indigenous traditions often emphasize reciprocity and balance, seeing humans as part of a web of life rather than its masters. Technocratic visions, more common in industrialized nations, frame nature as a system to be optimized. The global debate about geoengineering is not just about science, but about which worldview will dominate. If industrial powers push forward with interventions, will they impose their cultural assumptions on communities that reject them? The clash of values could become as divisive as the clash of interests. Even if governance, economics, and ethics could be reconciled, the practical challenges remain daunting. Take cloud brightening as an example. The idea is to spray fine seawater droplets into the air, creating brighter clouds that reflect more sunlight. On paper, it looks elegant and relatively safe. But scaling it requires fleets of ships, precise atmospheric monitoring, and coordination across vast oceanic regions. The long-term impacts on regional weather systems are still uncertain. Similarly, direct air capture, hailed as a breakthrough in carbon removal, currently operates at tiny scales. Scaling it to meaningful levels would require building tens of thousands of facilities, each demanding massive energy inputs. The challenge is not only scientific, but logistical and infrastructural. What makes the conversation even more urgent is that experiments are already underway, albeit at small scales. Pilot projects in the US, Europe, and Asia are testing technologies like air capture and aerosol dispersal. While these projects are framed as research, they set precedents. The line between research and deployment is blurry, especially when private companies are involved. Entrepreneurs eager to commercialize climate solutions may move faster than governments can regulate. The rise of climate startups illustrates this trend. Some promise carbon removal as a service, selling credits to corporations seeking to offset emissions. Others envision fleets of drones or ships managing solar radiation. While innovation is vital, the commercialization of geoengineering raises the risk of profit-driven interventions that prioritize short-term gains over long-term safety. Public participation will be critical in shaping the path forward. Without broad democratic engagement, geoengineering risks becoming a technocratic project imposed from above. Communities most affected by climate impacts, often in the global south, must have a voice in decisions that could alter their weather, agriculture, and survival. Yet historically, those same communities have had the least influence in global climate negotiations. This raises the prospect of climate colonialism, wealthy nations and corporations making decisions that disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. If geoengineering proceeds without addressing these injustices, it could replicate and amplify existing inequalities. Education and transparency offer one way forward. Instead of treating geoengineering as a taboo subject, governments and scientists must engage the public in honest conversations about risks and possibilities. This means acknowledging uncertainties, clarifying trade-offs, and resisting the temptation to oversell benefits. Public trust depends on openness. If people perceive that experiments are hidden or decisions are made in secret, backlash could derail legitimate research. On the other hand, transparent dialogue could create pathways for cautious exploration, ensuring that any future interventions are informed by both science and democratic accountability. The central paradox remains. Geoengineering may be both too dangerous to pursue and too dangerous to ignore. As climate change accelerates, the pressure to act will only grow. Extreme weather, food insecurity, and rising seas will push societies toward desperation. Political leaders facing angry citizens may grasp for technological quick fixes, even if the risks are poorly understood. The danger is not only in the technology itself, but in the political context that could drive its reckless use. Preparing for that possibility requires foresight now, developing governance frameworks, ethical guidelines, and robust research protocols before desperation sets in. To frame the question starkly, humanity is being forced to decide whether it is willing to play God with the climate. The temptation is powerful. The need is urgent. The risks are immense. The stakes could not be higher. If geoengineering is to have any role, it must be approached not as a silver bullet, but as a last resort, tightly controlled and globally governed. Even then, it will test our collective wisdom like nothing before. In the end, the survival of humanity will not depend on whether we can manipulate sunlight or capture carbon, but on whether we can act with restraint, equity, and cooperation. The climate crisis is a test not only of technology, but of governance and morality. Engineering Earth may one day be possible, but whether we can survive the risks of that engineering will depend on choices made long before the first particle is launched into the sky or the first gigaton of carbon is vacuumed from the air. Those choices begin now, and they demand a vision of humanity that is as humble as it is ambitious. The deeper humanity journeys into the debate on climate manipulation, the more it becomes clear that this is not just a scientific discussion, but a civilizational turning point. The very notion of engineering Earth's climate forces us to grapple with existential questions about our future, our ethics, and the systems we have built to govern ourselves. Part 1 laid out the temptation and the danger. Part 2 explored governance, economics, and the philosophical divide. Part 3 must now step into the human dimension, the real lives, the communities, and the future generations who will carry the consequences of whatever choices we make. And at the end, the question must be posed not only as analysis, but as a call to action. What will you, the viewer, do in the face of this dilemma? One of the most striking aspects of geoengineering is how unevenly its effects would be distributed. Climate change itself is not fair. The communities most vulnerable to its impacts are often those who contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions. Small island nations face rising seas that threaten their very existence. Rural farmers in Africa and Asia battle prolonged droughts and shifting rainfall patterns that make harvests unpredictable. Indigenous peoples in the Arctic see their ancestral lands vanish beneath melting ice. These are the front lines of the climate crisis. If geoengineering projects are launched, these same communities could once again bear the heaviest costs. A change in monsoon timing, a sudden drought triggered by altered atmospheric circulation, or a collapse of regional fisheries could devastate millions of lives. The moral stakes could not be higher. This imbalance exposes what many critics call the justice dimension of climate engineering. It is not only a matter of whether we can do it, but of who benefits and who pays the price. Imagine a scenario in which wealthy nations in the Northern Hemisphere deploy solar radiation management to cool the planet. While global temperatures drop, rainfall patterns in parts of Africa shift dramatically, creating famine conditions. Who holds responsibility for that suffering? Who compensates those lives lost? History suggests that the global system has often failed to deliver justice in moments of crisis. Will climate engineering repeat this pattern on a planetary scale? The conversation also reveals a profound intergenerational dilemma. Geoengineering projects, once started, could last for decades or centuries. If stratospheric aerosol injections were maintained for 100 years, that means generations not yet born would inherit the responsibility to continue them. If they stopped abruptly, termination shock could plunge the world into catastrophe. We risk binding future humanity into a commitment they did not choose, with consequences they cannot escape. This moral burden challenges the very concept of consent across time. We can agree to policies that affect us, but can we justly impose risks on people a century from now who had no say? At the same time, advocates of geoengineering remind us that doing nothing is itself a choice, and a dangerous one. Climate change is accelerating. The last decade has shattered temperature records, with entire regions enduring deadly heat waves that kill thousands in days. The Arctic has warmed more than twice as fast as the global average, unleashing feedback loops such as permafrost thaw and methane release. Extreme weather events have quadrupled in frequency since the 1970s, causing trillions of dollars in damages. For millions of people, the climate crisis is not a future scenario, but a daily emergency. Against this backdrop, geoengineering may appear not as hubris, but as compassion, an effort to shield vulnerable populations from suffering while the world struggles to reduce emissions. The tension between urgency and caution is not abstract. It is written in the lives of those who will either endure escalating disasters or risk the unknown effects of engineered interventions. There is also the psychological dimension. The idea that humanity could control the climate is both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, it reflects extraordinary progress in science and technology, proof of human ingenuity at the grandest scale. On the other hand, it highlights how far we have drifted from living in balance with the natural world. Many people feel a visceral discomfort at the thought of spraying aerosols into the stratosphere or brightening clouds across oceans. It seems like crossing a line from stewardship into domination. That discomfort is a reminder that geoengineering is not merely a technical project, but a cultural one. Whether it is accepted or resisted will depend as much on psychology, values, and identity as on scientific data. The debate is further complicated by the role of corporations and private actors. In recent years, entrepreneurs have begun experimenting with small-scale carbon removal technologies and even SRM prototypes. Some companies already sell carbon offsets based on direct air capture, framing it as a way for businesses to neutralize their emissions. While innovation is essential, the profit motive introduces dangerous incentives. A company might rush to deploy technology to secure a competitive advantage, downplaying risks or lobbying against regulations. Climate manipulation could become another arena of corporate power, shaped more by shareholder interests than by global justice. This raises the urgent need for regulation, transparency, and public oversight before private actors take the lead in manipulating Earth's systems. So, where does that leave us? The paradox remains that geoengineering is both too risky to embrace and too dangerous to ignore. The pathway forward must involve several principles. First, research, not deployment, must be the priority. Humanity cannot afford to experiment blindly at planetary scale. Small, carefully monitored trials under strict international supervision could provide critical data without unleashing uncontrollable effects. Second, governance frameworks must be developed before technologies are ready, not after. Waiting until a crisis forces desperate action is a recipe for chaos. International law, accountability mechanisms, and transparent decision-making must come first. Third, mitigation and adaptation must remain central. Geoengineering can never be a substitute for reducing emissions and building resilience. It can only ever serve at best as a complement or temporary measure. Finally, equity must guide every decision. The voices of vulnerable communities, the global south, and future generations must be heard. Without justice, climate manipulation will deepen divisions rather than heal them. And this is where you, the viewer, come into the picture. The question of geoengineering is not one to be left to scientists in labs or politicians in conference rooms. It is a question for all of humanity, and your awareness matters. The choices made about research, governance, and deployment will be shaped by public opinion, activism, and the pressure that ordinary people exert on institutions. If societies remain silent, decisions will be made in boardrooms and government chambers, perhaps without accountability. But if people demand transparency, ethics, and justice, the path of climate manipulation can be steered away from reckless experiments toward cautious, responsible exploration. So ask yourself, do you support research into geoengineering? Do you believe humanity should pursue the power to control Earth's climate, or should we resist the temptation? What safeguards would you demand before such projects ever move forward? These are not questions for the distant future. They are being debated right now, in scientific committees, international organizations, and corporate board meetings. Your awareness, your voice, and your action can shape the outcome. This channel, Crisis Lens, exists to bring such critical issues to light. By shining a spotlight on the risks and dilemmas of climate manipulation, we aim to empower you with the knowledge to engage in the conversation. But knowledge is only the beginning. The climate crisis is the defining challenge of our century, and the choices we make in the coming years will reverberate for centuries to come. If you have listened this far, you are already part of a growing community that refuses to look away. Together, we can demand accountability, justice, and wisdom in how humanity approaches the greatest experiment it has ever contemplated. Before you move on to the next video or scroll away, consider this. Silence is a decision. Choosing not to engage, not to learn, not to speak out is itself a choice that leaves power in the hands of others. If we are to navigate the perilous path of climate manipulation, it will require millions of voices insisting on caution, equity, and responsibility. That is where you come in. Join us on Crisis Lens as we continue to explore the greatest challenges of our time. From climate engineering to natural disasters, from geopolitical conflicts to the social transformations they spark. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay engaged. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with others who need to understand the stakes. Every view, every share, every comment helps amplify the conversation and build momentum for change. The future is not yet written, but it will be shaped by those who choose to act. Will you be one of them?